Today we're going to finish our last big piece of Latin grammar, and that is working with clauses that take both the subjunctive and the indicative, which actually makes them a little confusing. But this is our last big thing to learn. So let's get started. There are some words in Latin that introduce dependent clauses that can take both the subjunctive and the indicative. And so this is different from some of those other clauses that we've learned, purpose clauses or result clauses, indirect questions that always take the subjunctive, or other kinds of words that you've learned that always seem to take the indicative. But here we're going to learn some that can, in some circumstances, take one, and in other circumstances, take another. And that, I think, is the confusing thing. So we're not going to fuss about this too much. The more you practice, the more you'll understand. And some of our basic principles still apply. And that is that the indicative is used to show something that actually happened, show concrete information. And the subjunctive is used in situations usually where we're less sure about something. And we are going to follow sequence of tenses in primary and secondary sequence for these. So all of those rules still apply. And we're just going to try to figure out our best translation for a lot of these. But these words that take these subjunctive and indicative, depending on the situation, are words like cum, which you've already learned can mean when. It can also mean something like although or since. Dum, which can mean while, but it can also mean until or as long as or provided that. Quod, which means because, which we've seen before, but we'll talk about when it takes the subjunctive. Priusquam, and also its cousin antiquam, which means the same thing, but can also take either the subjunctive or the indicative. Quamquam and quamwis, which mean although. I think you've seen quamquam, but probably not quamwis. And so we're going to talk about when what happens. Okay, let's take a look. Let's start with cum clauses, and we'll talk more about this in class and do a lot of practice with these. So again, this is really an introduction and an opportunity for you to learn some new information, but don't think that this is the final word on this, okay? So these can be tricky because cum can be translated in three different ways. That is, it can be a causal clause that means since or because. It can also be a concessive clause that means although, and it can be a clause that means when, and we'll talk about these in just a little bit. Now, when they take the subjunctive, they follow sequence of tenses. So being able to sort of figure out what's going on, I don't think should be hard. And when cum means although or since and because, it will always take the subjunctive. So if you see this situation where it's although or since or because, you know you're going to have a subjunctive there. When it means when, and we're in primary sequence, it takes the indicative. And we'll talk about why this is in just a minute when we look at some examples. And when it means when, and we're in secondary sequence, it can take either the subjunctive or the indicative. Okay, so although, since, always the subjunctive following sequence of tenses. When in primary sequence, indicative. When in secondary sequence, either the subjunctive or the indicative. Let's look. So here are some examples of those concessive or causal types. Right, so here's the concessive example. Okay, so cum poeta me amet, nautam amo. Although the poet loves me, I love the sailor. And if we went into secondary sequence, cum poeta me amaret, nautam amavam. Although the poet loved me, I love the sailor. So this is sort of the rule. You can see, in some ways, you might not think there's much of a rationale for using the subjunctive here. That's something we can talk about later if you want to, but you can see what's going on here. Sometimes in here, in our main clause, you'll see the word tamen, nevertheless. And that's always a good hint, if you have it, that your cum should be translated as although. If we look at the next example, cum poeta me amet, flores mihi dat. Since the poet loves me, he gives me flowers. Or in secondary sequence, cum poeta me amaret, flores mihi dedit. Since the poet loved me, he gave me flowers. So again, you can see this is, as in the example above, present subjunctive because we're in primary sequence, same time. Imperfect subjunctive in secondary sequence, same time. We translate both as past tenses. You can see in all of these examples, we are not translating the subjunctive in a subjunctive-y way. We're translating it as an indicative, essentially. Okay. You can also see that if we don't have a tamen, that we could look at something like, let's see, this sentence and wonder, is this a since clause or is this an although clause? And the best way you can figure it out is by trying it. So you could say, although the poet loves me, he gives me flowers, which doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Since the poet loves me, he gives me flowers, makes a lot more sense. And that's really how you have to do it to figure out what's going on. Do you have a since because clause or do you have an although clause? Just trial and error, okay? Because often they will look the same. Cum clauses that mean when are a little trickier. And they're not trickier in the primary sequence because in primary it's always going to take the indicative. So this is sort of a helpful thing. If you see cum plus the indicative, you're going to, in the primary sequence, you're going to translate it when, right? And here we are in primary sequence, and so we know the only option here is to translate it when. So cum poete mihi flores dat, gratias dico. When the poet gives me flowers, I say, thanks. And if we put this in secondary sequence, in this situation again, cum is going to take the indicative. Cum poeta mihi flores dedit, gratias. This should be dixi. Right? So when the poet gave me flowers, I said, thanks. So all we're doing in this situation is taking that first situation and putting it into the past tense. You can see that for both of these, we're really using the indicative because what we're talking about is a factual situation. So the poet gives me flowers, and so when he does that, I say, thanks. When the poet gave me flowers yesterday, I said, thanks. There's nothing subjunctive-y about it. There's nothing possible or uncertain. This is just something that happened. In the next example, this is in secondary sequence, but here our verb is in the imperfect subjunctive. And let's look at this situation. So it's cum ver floreret, poeta flores mihi dedit. So when spring was blooming, the poet gave me flowers. So this situation, you might think, oh, well, that's just a factual situation. And it certainly could be. We could talk about that. But in some ways, this is more just like the background to the situation. Or specifically, it's talking about a kind of cause and effect relationship, right? The implication is that he gave me flowers in the springtime because that's the time when flowers are actually in season, and so he was able to give them to me. So there's a sense that these are the general circumstances, right, sort of surrounding why he gave me the flowers. And so it's not just these two separate factual pieces of information, but there is a link between them. And it's because of that link that we have the subjunctive. Again, if you just looked at this sentence, is it possible that this could be a causal clause or a concessive clause? Although spring was blooming, the poet gave me flowers. Well, that's a possible translation, but it doesn't make much sense. Since spring was blooming, the poet gave me flowers. That's certainly possible. When spring was blooming, the poet gave me flowers. Also possible. So you have to sort of work it out and see what would make the most sense. And obviously, we're doing our best to translate from one language into another. And so sometimes there are different possibilities. And of course, as always, context will help you. Okay? Our next kind of clause are doom clauses. And doom, I think, you have seen meaning while. But doom can mean other things too. And its meaning changes depending on the mood and tense of the verb. So we're going to spend a little time going through the 4 different choices we have just so you can see. So the most common one is when it means while. This one always takes the present indicative, even if we're in past tense. In this sense, the present indicative kind of works like, to show same time as, in a sense. So let's look at the examples here. So, dum poeta carmina scribit, puellae cantant. While the poet writes songs, the girls sing. So these things are happening simultaneously, right? But we could also say, dum poetas carmina scribit, puellae cantaverat. While the poet wrote songs, the girls sang. So the idea is, while the poet is writing songs, the girls sang. That is, these two things are happening at the same time, and that's why we have it. But they're in the indicative because it's totally factual, right? This is just something that while one thing happens, the other thing happens. No uncertainty about it. Okay? Dum can also mean as long as. And here we also use the indicative because we're really talking again about two things that are happening at the same time. And while one happens, that is, as long as one thing happens, then for that same amount of time, another thing happens. So it's, in some ways, it's very close to while. We're just talking about these sort of boundaries now instead of an indefinite period of time. And these are going to take the same tense of the indicative, usually. So if you have present indicative in one, you have present indicative in the other. If you have perfect indicative in one, you'll have perfect indicative in the other. So here you can see I give 2 different examples. The first one has the imperfect indicative, and the second one has the present. Right? So, dum poeta Romae erat, erat Felix. As long as the poet was in Rome, he was happy. So here, we don't know how long he was in Rome. Maybe he was in Rome for a month. During that month-long period of time, he was happy. Maybe once he left, he was bitterly unhappy. But for that time, as long as he's in Rome, then he's happy. Right? And you can see the sort of connection with while there, but you can see that there are also fixed boundaries. Dum poeta carmina scribit est Felix. So as long as the poet writes songs, he is happy. Now, could we translate this while? We sure could, because this is a present indicative. While the poet writes songs, he is happy. And you can see that there is a kind of overlap here between as long as and while. But you can also see that both of them take the indicative, and really what we're talking about is factual information. Our next one is dum that means provided that. And there's also this word dum modo that means provided that you often see instead of dum. It is negated not with non, but with ne. But you'll see both the dum or dum modo and the ne in the negative sentence, the negative clause. This usually takes a present subjunctive. This is because when we're talking about the provided that something is the case, we're really saying, well, it may be the case and it may not be the case. It's not factual. It's not as long as this one thing happens, another thing happens, or while one thing happens, another thing happens. We're saying if the circumstances are right, then this other thing will happen. And so it's a slightly different idea, slightly less certain, and so we're going to use the subjunctive. So, for example, in our first sentence, dum or dum modo poeta Romae ne sit, ero felix. Provided that the poet is not in Rome, I will be happy. So you can see that my happiness is completely predicated on the fact that this poet is not going to be in Rome. If he's in Rome, then suddenly I'm not happy, right? In the second example, you can see too that this one is a positive one. Dum modo poeta mox veniat, cantare poteret. Provided that the poet comes soon, he will be able to sing. If he doesn't come soon, he's going to miss the concert and he's not going to be able to sing. But provided that he comes soon, he will be able to sing. So both of these you can see have a present subjunctive. Both of these you can see have a future indicative. Now this won't always be the case, but it is often the case because usually these provided that situations, you're talking about some kind of future thing. Provided that this happens, this other thing will happen, right? So it's really future looking. And you can see too that as in our other kinds of clauses, we're not translating these in a subjunctive-y way, even though they're in the subjunctive. We just translate them like a present indicative. But this future sense, right, a future verb in the main clause would be a good hint that we probably are talking about provided that. And of course, if you have dum modo, it has to mean provided that. That's the only thing that dum modo can mean. Here's our last usage. Dum can sometimes mean until. When it means until, it usually takes the subjunctive, although it can take the indicative. And the subjunctive usually indicates that there's some kind of expectation that this thing is actually going to happen this way, even though it hasn't happened yet, right? So here are some examples. Romae manebo dum poeta veniat. I will remain in Rome until the poet comes, and I am expecting him to come, so I will remain in Rome until he comes. Okay. So could this be one of those proviso ones? Well, yeah, here we have a future indicative verb, right? I will remain in Rome provided that he comes. But that doesn't make as much sense, right? Until is probably better. So pugnabimus dum auxilium mitat or mitunt, right? We will fight until they send help, right? Which we expect will come. That's why we use the subjunctive here, right? Or I could say, pugnabimus dum auxilium mitunt. We will fight until they send help, but boy, maybe that help will come and maybe it won't. I have no expectation that it will come, but we will fight nevertheless. Okay? So here, it's not that the translation changes in any way. It's just that the expectation is slightly different. One signals, I think this may actually happen, but if you use the indicative, you're not really siding one way or the other. Okay. So dum has these four meanings: while, as long as, provided that, and until. And I think this feels like a very kind of higgledy-piggledy mess, and it is kind of a higgledy-piggledy mess. But if you remember that there are those four possible translations, and then just try to work with your sentences to see what makes most sense, that's going to be the easiest thing. And we will, of course, practice this more in class. We just have a couple more little things to look at. One is quod. Quod always means because, and you, except when it's a relative pronoun, of course, but if it means because, that's what it's going to mean. You've seen it meaning because since, I think, chapter 3, and it has always taken an indicative, and it almost always does. It can, however, take a subjunctive, and that's when whoever is speaking the sentence or writing the sentence doesn't want to say that they think this is absolutely the reason why something is happening. They are attributing this to somebody else, and they are not willing to take a side. Okay, and so here I've given you an example. Caesar Gallium vicit quod fortis erat. Okay, here we have the indicative. Caesar conquered Gaul because he was brave. If I say this, then I am saying, this is my opinion. I totally believe that the reason why Caesar conquered Gaul was because he was brave. End of story. My idea. In the next sentence, Caesar Gallium vicit quod fortis esset. Caesar conquered Gaul because he was brave. You can see there's no difference in translation. Absolutely none, right? That's the same. But I use the subjunctive here because what I'm saying is, this is what other people think. But me, I'm not so sure that that's the reason why he conquered Gaul. Maybe I think he did it because he was tricky. Maybe I think he did it because he had a lot of help. Maybe I think he did it because the Gauls were really cowardly. Whatever. What I'm saying when I use esset is that I'm not willing to take a stand on this particular statement. I've heard this said, I'm reporting it, but maybe it's right and maybe it's not. So the only thing the subjunctive does there is it gives you information about the speaker's outlook. Another kind of clause that we have are these clauses called priusquam and antequam. Both of these clauses mean before. So before something happened, blah, blah, blah. I think maybe you've seen its opposite, which is postquam, which always takes the indicative. There's nothing terribly interesting about postquam clauses. But priusquam and antequam, if you happen to see antequam, will use the indicative if it's just a simple statement of fact. This is kind of like those cum clauses that mean when that take the indicative, or quod clauses that take the indicative, or these dum clauses that take the indicative. When you're saying, well, while this one thing happened, this happened. Before this happened, this happened. And so there is just nothing terribly interesting at all about this. But if we are saying instead in the priusquam clause that there was an expectation that something would happen first, then we use the subjunctive. We would use the present subjunctive for primary sequence, imperfect subjunctive in secondary sequence. And I've given you some examples here to try to show you the difference between the two. So in the first one, poeta carmina scripsit priusquam illa cantavit. The poet wrote the songs before he sang them. This is logical. You can't sing the songs until you have written them. First he wrote the songs, then he sang them. Right? He wrote the songs before he sang them. Priusquam illa cantavit, indicative. Our second example, poeta mortuus est priusquam carmina scriberet. The poet died before he wrote or could write the songs. So you can see first of all, this one we actually can translate in a subjunctive way. And you can see there was, before he wrote the songs, he died. That is, he never actually wrote the songs, right? Before he could actually do this thing, he died. There was an expectation that he was going to do it and then sing them, but it was never accomplished. Okay? And so in those situations where there's this sort of anticipation that something would happen, then we use the subjunctive. You can see that this is almost like a contrary to fact idea, and that's why we have to have the subjunctive in the priusquam part of the sentence. One additional thing is that sometimes in sentences you will see priusquam and antequam broken up into two words, and they will be separated by maybe a word or two, but you want to translate them together. They will go together even though they're broken up. Okay. And finally, these words quam and quamvis. Both of them mean although. Originally, in Latin, quam always took the indicative, quamvis always took the subjunctive, and this is a rule that I think in some authors really holds true, although once you get into the classical period and beyond, that rule starts to fall apart. So some people follow it and some don't. Some people use the indicative, some people use the subjunctive. It doesn't really matter. If you use the indicative, you use the indicative. If you use the subjunctive, you use it following sequence of tenses. So you can see both, and it doesn't usually cause any kind of problem. So follow up. Cum, dum, quod, priusquam, antequam, quam, quamvis. All of these are words that can take the subjunctive or the indicative. The indicative tends to be used to show things that actually happen. The subjunctive tends to be used to show things that are uncertain or possible. The subjunctive follows sequence of tenses. So if we're in primary sequence, we're going to use present or perfect subjunctive. If we're in secondary sequence, we will use imperfect or pluperfect subjunctive. And there are, it seems, a lot of rules for how we translate different words depending on what tenses follow them. I think that your best strategy is to learn the possible translations for these words and not to worry overly much about what tense of what verb or what mood you see, and think about what's going on. If we have an indicative, is something factual going on? Then how do we show that it's a fact? And if it's a subjunctive, is something that is not quite sure going on? And how do we show that something not quite sure is happening? In class, I'm going to give you some handouts, especially on cum clauses, also on dum clauses, and one that sort of sums up all the clauses that we have worked with over the past several weeks. But make sure that you send me your 3 questions. I know that you probably have lots and lots of questions about this, but think about the things that are maybe most odd to you or places where this feels really unsure. Send those to me so that I can make sure that I create some sentences that we can use to practice with in class.